They said the Empress never noticed anything beneath her throne, but that wasn't entirely true, because on the day the chamber lights dimmed to that cold violet hue and the air recyclers hummed like a distant storm, Empress Lyra Vera paused, not for a general, not for a diplomat, but for a man no one else could see. Ethan Cole kept his head down as he wiped a thin layer of dark residue from the polished floor, the cloth in his hand moving in steady, practiced circles, the kind that came from doing the same invisible job for years without recognition, his maintenance badge flickering weakly against his chest display, its battery overdue for replacement, though he hadn't bothered requesting one, because requests from people like him rarely reached anyone who mattered. Above him, the throne loomed, 20 feet of curved alloy and crystalline circuitry, softly pulsing with imperial authority, its surface reflecting fragmented images of the chamber like a broken mirror, and Ethan made sure not to look at it for too long, because staring at power had a way of reminding you how far away you were from it. The temperature hovered at a precise 68 degrees Fahrenheit, climate-controlled perfection, yet the room still felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with numbers, a quiet kind of cold that settled into the bones, the kind that came from silence enforced rather than chosen. The doors behind him parted with a low hydraulic sigh, and the sound alone was enough to make every technician, every guard, every servant in the chamber straighten instinctively. But Ethan didn't turn right away, not because he was defiant, but because he had learned that sudden movements drew attention, and attention, in a place like this, was rarely a gift. The Empress entered without announcement, her presence carried not by sound but by the subtle shift in the room itself, as if the air adjusted to accommodate her, her skin catching the ambient light in shades of deep violet and silver, her gaze sweeping across the chamber with precise calculation, missing nothing and yet caring for very little. Because in her world, value was measured in efficiency, in outcomes, in power, and Ethan Cole was none of those things. He finally rose to one knee, not fully bowing, just enough to acknowledge protocol without disrupting the work still clinging to his hands, and for a moment, that was all he expected, to be another piece of background noise in a system too vast to notice him. But then her steps slowed, just slightly, a fraction of a second that most would never catch, and her eyes shifted, not to the throne, not to the advisors waiting in silent formation, but downward, toward the man holding a worn cloth and a flickering badge. "You are still here," she said, her voice calm, controlled, almost curious, as if observing a variable that refused to behave as predicted, and Ethan blinked once, surprised not by the words themselves, but by the fact they were directed at him at all, his voice steady when he answered, "Yes, ma'am, something needed fixing." And it wasn't defiance, it wasn't pride, it was just the truth, plain and simple, the kind of answer no one in that room was used to hearing. For a second that stretched longer than it should have, the Empress studied him, not with judgment, not with approval, but with something far more dangerous, interest, and somewhere deep in the endless systems of the Empire, something small and unnoticed began to shift, not with noise, not with force, but with the quiet weight of a single human decision that refused to follow the rules. The chamber did not return to normal after that moment, even though every system resumed its perfect rhythm and every official returned to their assigned position, because something subtle had shifted in the invisible layers that governed attention, and for the first time since Ethan Cole had stepped onto this station 3 years ago, his presence had been registered by someone who mattered. He went back to work the way he always did, wiping the last trace of residue from the alloy floor and disposing of the cloth in a recycling unit that hummed softly as it broke the fibers down into usable material, his movements efficient, unremarkable, exactly the way they were supposed to be, yet his mind replayed her words in a loop he could not quite silence, not because they were meaningful on their own, but because they had been directed at him, and that alone felt like a disruption in a system that had never once acknowledged him before. Across the chamber, the Empress had already moved on, her attention redirected to a series of holographic projections hovering at eye level, each one displaying data streams that shifted faster than most minds could process, energy outputs, population metrics, logistical reports, all reduced to numbers and probabilities, and yet every few seconds, her gaze flickered, just briefly, toward the lower levels of the room where maintenance staff operated, as if confirming that the anomaly she had observed had not vanished. Ethan did not notice those glances, but he did notice something else, a flicker in the wall panel to his left, a minor fault in the power distribution grid that caused the light strip to dim by a fraction of a percent. invisible to most, irrelevant to command, but to him it stood out immediately, a small imperfection in an otherwise flawless system, and without hesitation, he moved toward it, kneeling beside the panel and removing the access plate with a handheld tool that clicked softly as it disengaged the magnetic seals. Inside, the circuitry glowed a steady blue, except for one node that pulsed irregularly, its signal out of sync with the rest of the network, and Ethan frowned slightly, not in frustration, but in concentration, because this was the kind of problem he understood, not political tension or imperial hierarchy, just a broken thing that needed to be made right. He adjusted the connection manually, bypassing a degraded conduit and rerouting the current through a secondary line, his fingers steady despite the faint hum of energy beneath the surface, and within seconds, the pulse stabilized, the light strip above returning to full intensity as if nothing had ever been wrong. He exhaled quietly, replacing the panel and securing it in place, already turning back to his routine when a voice cut through the ambient noise again, closer this time. You corrected it without authorization, and Ethan froze for half a second before turning his head, just enough to confirm what he already knew. The Empress stood no more than 10 feet away, her presence commanding the space without effort, her eyes fixed not on the system he had repaired, but on him. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on the edge of his uniform out of habit rather than necessity. It was malfunctioning, he said, his tone even, not defensive, not apologetic, simply stating a fact the way he always did, and for a moment, the silence between them stretched, filled only by the quiet hum of perfectly functioning machinery. It was within acceptable parameters, she replied, her voice measured, as if reciting a rule that had governed her entire life, and Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. Maybe, he said, but it was still broken, and there it was again, that same quiet contradiction, not loud enough to be called defiance, not soft enough to be dismissed, just a simple human judgment placed against a system that did not account for it. The Empress did not respond immediately, her gaze shifting briefly to the panel he had repaired, then back to him, and for the first time, there was something new in her expression, not confusion, not irritation, but the faintest trace of calculation directed not at a system, but at a person, as if she were trying to understand why a man with no authority, no recognition, and no obligation would choose to act outside the boundaries set for him. And somewhere beneath the layers of logic that defined her world, a question began to form, one that did not fit into any existing model, and that made it impossible to ignore. The Empress did not move for several seconds after his answer, and in a chamber where every decision was executed in fractions of a heartbeat, that pause carried more weight than any command, her gaze remaining fixed on Ethan Cole as if recalculating something that had never required calculation before, while he simply stood there with quiet patience, not rigid like a soldier, not nervous like a subordinate awaiting judgment, just present, as though the moment itself did not demand anything more from him. Around them, the chamber continued its precise orchestration, advisors exchanging data streams in low voices, guards maintaining perfect formation, systems humming in flawless synchronization, and yet a subtle tension threaded through it all, the kind that spread without sound when something unpredictable entered a controlled environment. You acted outside your assigned function, she said at last, her tone unchanged, but the words felt less like a reprimand and more like an observation she was testing for accuracy. And Ethan gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without retreating from it. Yes, ma'am, he replied, then added after a brief pause, but the system runs better when everything works, and there it was again, that same simple logic that did not align with the layered complexity of imperial protocol, a logic that prioritized function in a way that ignored hierarchy entirely. Lyra Vera's eyes shifted slightly, not away from him, but deeper, as if she were examining not just the outcome of his action, but the reasoning behind it, because in her world, every action served a purpose tied to efficiency, survival, or dominance, and yet this man's choices seemed to originate from something else entirely, something that did not increase his status, did not earn him recognition, and did not protect him from consequence, and that contradiction refused to resolve itself. There are thresholds for acceptable deviation, she said, almost as if reminding herself of a rule she had followed without question for years, and Ethan considered that for a moment, his brow tightening just slightly as he processed it. Then maybe the thresholds are wrong, he answered quietly, not challenging her authority, not even looking directly at her when he said it. just stating another truth the same way he always did, as if truth itself did not require permission. The chamber seemed to hold its breath, not literally, but in the way a perfectly balanced system reacts when a variable shifts beyond predicted limits, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered. Across the Empress's expression, not anger, not offense, but something closer to curiosity sharpened by resistance, as though part of her rejected the statement while another part could not dismiss it. She turned away then, her attention returning to the holographic displays as if the conversation had reached its end, and yet the silence that followed did not feel like closure, it felt like something unresolved had been set aside rather than concluded. Ethan exhaled softly, not in relief, but in acceptance, and returned to his work without waiting for dismissal, because that was what he did. He fixed things that needed fixing, whether they were noticed or not, whether they were permitted or not. Because to him, broken was broken, and leaving it that way had never made sense. Across the chamber, Lyra continued to review the data streams, but her focus fractured in subtle ways, her attention drifting back to the maintenance logs that now flagged Ethan Cole as a recurring anomaly, a human who consistently operated beyond defined parameters without measurable gain, and for the first time in her reign, she did not dismiss the anomaly as inefficiency, she marked it for observation. A small, silent decision entered into the system without announcement, and somewhere deep within the architecture of her empire, a new variable had been acknowledged, one that did not fit, one that did not obey, and one that, for reasons she could not yet define, she chose not to remove. The observation order did not appear on any visible display, and no announcement echoed through the chamber, yet within the deeper layers of the imperial system, a silent directive propagated with flawless precision, redirecting a fraction of surveillance bandwidth toward a single, insignificant human technician whose name had only just been recorded as relevant. Ethan Cole did not know he had been marked, and nothing in his routine changed to suggest he ever would, because he moved through the station the same way he always had, unnoticed, unremarkable, carrying a compact toolkit that clicked softly against his hip as he navigated maintenance corridors that stretched for miles behind the polished surfaces of the imperial complex, corridors that most officials never saw and never thought about, because in a system designed for perfection, the infrastructure was expected to function without drawing attention. The air down there was cooler by several degrees, hovering closer to 62 degrees Fahrenheit, and carried a faint metallic scent that came from constant energy flow through reinforced conduits, and Ethan preferred it that way, because the silence felt honest, not imposed, not curated, just the natural hum of things doing what they were built to do. He paused at a junction where 3 conduit lines intersected, his handheld scanner emitting a soft pulse as it read fluctuating energy signatures, and he frowned slightly when one line showed a minor instability, nothing critical, nothing that would trigger an alert, but enough to cause inefficiency over time, and without hesitation, he crouched down and opened the access panel, setting his tools beside him in a neat arrangement that spoke of habit rather than necessity. Above him, unseen, a cluster of microsensors adjusted their focus, feeding real-time data into a higher-level monitoring system, translating his movements into patterns, his decisions into variables, and transmitting it all to a central interface where Empress Lyra Vera stood alone in a private observation chamber, the lighting dimmed to a soft violet that reflected off her skin in muted gradients, her eyes fixed on the projection before her as it displayed Ethan's actions in precise detail, every motion slowed, analyzed, categorized. She watched as he bypassed a standard protocol, not out of ignorance, but with deliberate intent, rerouting power through a secondary channel that was technically less efficient in the short term but more stable over extended cycles, and her gaze narrowed slightly, because the system would not have made that choice, it would have prioritized immediate output over long-term balance, and yet this human had done the opposite without instruction, without authorization, and without any apparent benefit to himself. Explain the deviation, she said quietly, though no one stood beside her, and a moment later, the system responded in a neutral tone, outlining the parameters Ethan had exceeded and the minor gain in long-term stability his action had achieved, but the explanation felt incomplete, because it described what he had done, not why he had done it. On the screen, Ethan finished the adjustment and sat back on his heels for a moment, glancing at the stabilized readings with a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of quiet satisfaction that held no trace of ambition, no expectation of recognition, just the simple acknowledgement that something broken had been made right. and then he reached into his pack, pulling out a small, worn object that did not belong to any official toolkit, a strip of insulating material he had saved from a previous repair, and he reinforced the connection further, adding an extra layer of protection that the system had not required, that no protocol had demanded, but that he chose to apply anyway. Lyra's fingers tightened slightly at her side, not in tension, but in focus, because this was no longer a single anomaly, it was a pattern, a consistent divergence from expected behavior that could not be explained by error or inefficiency, and for the first time, she began to consider a possibility that had never held relevance before, that this human's actions were not deviations at all, but expressions of a different kind of logic, one that operated outside the boundaries of her empire's design. The projection shifted as Ethan stood and gathered his tools, moving on to the next task without hesitation, leaving behind a system that now functioned better than it had before. Though no report would credit him for it, no metric would highlight his contribution, and no authority would acknowledge his presence, and yet Lyra did not look away, her gaze following him as he disappeared down the corridor, her mind no longer focused on the efficiency of the system, but on the quiet, persistent question that refused to resolve: why would someone with nothing to gain continue to act as though it mattered? And why did that answer feel more important than any calculation she had ever made? The system did not question patterns that improved efficiency, but it did flag patterns that could not be explained, and over the next cycle, Ethan Cole's name began appearing in reports that were never meant for human review, lines of quiet data buried beneath layers of operational metrics, each one marking a deviation that produced no measurable reward yet consistently resulted in subtle improvements, and while no official directive had been issued against him, the system itself had begun to treat him as an irregularity. Ethan remained unaware of any of it, moving through the lower sectors of the station with the same steady rhythm, his boots echoing softly against reinforced flooring as he carried a small crate of replacement components down a corridor that stretched nearly half a mile, the overhead lighting flickering once every 20 seconds due to a calibration drift that had gone uncorrected for months, not because it could not be fixed, but because it did not meet the threshold required for resource allocation. He noticed it immediately, of course, because he always did, and as he passed beneath the third flicker, he paused, shifting the crate to one arm while he reached up with the other, tapping the panel lightly as if confirming what he already knew, and then, without setting the crate down, he made a small adjustment to the exposed interface, correcting the timing variance with a precise movement that took less than 5 seconds. The light stabilized instantly, the flicker gone as if it had never existed, and Ethan gave a quiet nod to himself before continuing on his way, because that was enough for him. The problem had been there, and now it was not, far above. In the observation chamber, Lyra Vera watched the correction appear in real time, the system registering the change as a resolved anomaly with no assigned cause, because Ethan had not logged the repair, had not requested authorization, and had not recorded his intervention in any official capacity, and that absence of documentation unsettled her more than the deviation itself, because it meant his actions existed outside the system's understanding entirely. "Why is there no record?" she asked, her voice low, directed not at a person but at the architecture surrounding her, and the system responded with clinical precision. No request was submitted, no authorization granted, no action logged, and for a moment, that answer satisfied the logic she had relied on for years, until she looked back at the live feed and saw Ethan again, kneeling beside a maintenance drone whose movement had slowed to an inefficient crawl, its power core operating below optimal capacity yet still within acceptable parameters, and she watched as he opened its casing, not hurried, not concerned with being seen, simply focused, adjusting a connection that would extend the drone's operational life far beyond what the system had deemed necessary. "It is still functional," she said, almost to herself, as if repeating the rule that defined worth within her empire, and yet Ethan did not treat it that way. He worked with the same care he applied to every system, every panel, every small imperfection he encountered, as though function alone was not enough, as though there was value in improvement even when no one asked for it. When he finished, the drone emitted a soft, steady hum, its movement smoother, its response time faster, and Ethan rested his hand briefly against its casing, not as a command, not as a test, just a quiet acknowledgement before he closed the panel and stood, collecting his tools without hesitation. Lyra's gaze did not leave the projection, her mind no longer categorizing his actions as inefficiencies, but as something far more complex, something that suggested intent beyond survival or obligation, and for the first time, she felt the faintest disruption in the certainty that had guided her rule, because the system had always been enough. Its logic flawless, its outcomes predictable, and yet this human operated within it without following it, improving it without being part of it, and existing in a way that could not be reduced to data. She stepped closer to the projection, the light shifting across her features as she studied him more closely, and in that moment, the question that had begun as a calculation changed into something else entirely. Something quieter, something deeper, not what he was doing, but why it mattered to him at all, and why, for reasons she could not yet understand, it was beginning to matter to her. The question did not leave her, and that was the first anomaly Lyra Vera could not isolate or suppress. Because it followed her beyond the observation chamber, beyond the data streams and the structured certainty of her empire, settling into the quiet spaces between decisions where no system had ever been required to intervene. The next cycle began with routine briefings, projections of expansion metrics, resource allocations, diplomatic movements across 12 systems, all presented with flawless precision on floating interfaces that responded instantly to her gestures, and yet her focus fractured in ways no one around her could detect, her attention returning again and again to a single unresolved variable that refused to conform. "Proceed," she said at one point, though she had not processed the last report, and the advisor paused for a fraction of a second before continuing, unaware that the Empress, who had never missed a detail, was now listening to something else entirely. Far below, Ethan Cole moved through a section of the station rarely accessed by upper command, a structural maintenance zone that stretched nearly 300 yards along the outer ring, where the curvature of the station became visible through reinforced observation panels, the stars beyond appearing distant and still, like fixed points in a system that never changed, and he stopped there for a moment, setting his toolkit down beside him as he adjusted a stabilizer bracket that had loosened by less than 1/8 of an inch, a deviation too small to trigger any alert, yet enough for him to notice. He tightened the bracket with careful precision, testing the alignment twice before stepping back, his breath steady, his movements unhurried, and then he did something the system would never have predicted. He remained there, just for a moment, looking out through the transparent panel at the expanse beyond, not analyzing, not calculating, simply observing. Above him, the surveillance feed captured everything, transmitting the image in real time to Lyra's private interface, and she saw it clearly, the way he paused, the way his shoulders relaxed slightly as he looked outward, and there was no data point for that, no measurable gain, no efficiency increase, just a moment that existed without purpose, and yet it held a weight she could not define. "Why does he stop?" she asked, her voice quieter now, less command and more inquiry, and the system responded with its usual neutrality, no functional objective detected, and that answer, for the first time, felt insufficient. She stepped closer to the display, her reflection faintly visible in the projection as it overlapped with the image of a man who had no authority, no influence, and no reason to matter, and yet she found herself watching not his actions, but the absence of action, the space where nothing was required and yet something still existed. Ethan eventually turned back to his work, retrieving his tools and continuing down the corridor, unaware that his brief pause had been observed, unaware that it had created a ripple far beyond its scale, because in that single moment, he had demonstrated something her empire had never accounted for, the ability to exist without function, to choose stillness without inefficiency, and to find value in something that could not be measured. Lyra remained where she was long after he had moved on, her gaze fixed on the empty section of corridor now devoid of movement, and for the first time since she had taken the throne, she did not issue a command, did not adjust a system, did not correct a deviation. She simply stood there, holding a question that no calculation could answer. And in the silence that followed, something within her began to shift, not with force, not with resistance, but with the quiet realization that there might be aspects of existence her empire had never been designed to understand. The shift became visible not in the lower corridors where Ethan Cole continued his quiet work, but in the highest levels of the empire where every decision once followed a precise and predictable path, because for the first time, Empress Lyra Vera hesitated before confirming a directive that had already been calculated as optimal. The council chamber was vast, nearly 100 feet across, its curved walls lined with luminous panels displaying real-time data from across the empire, and at The center, a projection hovered above a circular platform, outlining a resource reallocation protocol that would deactivate several non-critical support systems in distant sectors to improve overall efficiency, a decision that, by all established metrics, was correct. Proceed with execution, one advisor said, their voice measured, confident, because there had never been a reason to doubt the system's conclusions, and all eyes turned toward the Empress. Waiting for the confirmation that always came without delay, Lyra stood still, her gaze fixed on the projection, the numbers clear, the outcome certain, and yet something within her resisted, not with force, but with a quiet uncertainty that had not existed before, because she had seen what those systems represented beyond their efficiency values. She had seen a maintenance drone continue to function longer than expected because someone chose to care. She had seen a corridor stabilized before failure occurred because someone refused to ignore a small flaw, and she had seen a human pause. Not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. What is the impact on localized function, she asked, and the question alone caused a subtle shift in the room, because it was not one she would normally ask, and the system responded immediately. Localized efficiency will decrease by 3.2%, overall gain remains within optimal parameters, and for a moment, that answer should have been enough. It always had been, but now it felt incomplete, because it described performance, not experience. Far below, Ethan moved into another section of the station, carrying a small diagnostic unit that emitted a steady, low-frequency tone as it scanned the surrounding structure, and he stopped beside a wall panel that showed no visible issue, no alert, no deviation, and yet he crouched down anyway, placing the scanner against the surface and watching the readings with quiet focus, his brow tightening slightly as he detected a faint irregularity that would not have been noticed for weeks, maybe months, and even then, only when it became significant enough to matter. He opened the panel and began making adjustments, slow and deliberate, correcting something that did not yet need correction, simply because he knew it would, and as he worked, he spoke softly, not to anyone in particular, just a habit formed over time, better now than later, the words barely audible, but clear enough to be captured by the sensors monitoring him. Above, Lyra heard them through the feed, and for a moment, the council chamber faded into the background as her attention locked onto that simple statement. Because it carried a logic the system did not use, a logic that prioritized prevention over reaction, care over calculation, and choice over instruction. She turned back to the projection in front of her, the decision still waiting, the system still expecting confirmation, and without raising her voice, without any dramatic shift in tone, she said, "Delay the reallocation," and the room went still, not in shock, but in quiet recalibration, because the command did not align with the projected optimal outcome, and yet it came from the one authority that could not be overridden. Clarify reason, the system requested, not as a challenge, but as a procedural necessity, and for the first time, Lyra did not provide a numerical justification, did not reference efficiency metrics or strategic advantage. She simply said, "It is not necessary yet," and that was all, a decision made not from data, but from something else entirely. Far below, Ethan finished his adjustment and closed the panel, unaware that his quiet approach to a small, unseen problem had just influenced a decision that reached across entire systems, unaware that his simple belief in fixing things before they broke had begun to alter the behavior of an empire built on perfect calculation, and as he stood and moved on to his next task, the station continued to function as it always had, smooth, precise, efficient, but now, beneath that perfection, something new had taken root, something subtle, something human, and it was beginning to spread. The change did not go unnoticed, because in a system built on absolute consistency, even the smallest deviation from optimal logic created ripples that could not be fully contained, and within hours of the delayed reallocation order, internal monitors flagged the decision as an anomaly requiring review, not as an error, but as something that did not align with established predictive models. In the upper levels of the station, advisors recalibrated their projections, adjusting for a command that had no numerical justification, and though none openly questioned the Empress, the system itself began to respond, quietly increasing its scrutiny on the source of irregular influence that had appeared without warning. Far below, Ethan Cole stepped into a dimly lit service bay that stretched nearly 80 feet across, its walls lined with inactive units and dormant systems awaiting scheduled decommission, their status lights dim but still functional, still present, though no longer prioritized by the system's efficiency models, and he paused there, not because he had been assigned to that section, but because something felt off, a subtle imbalance in the ambient hum that most would never notice, but to him stood out immediately. He moved toward a unit. Near the far wall, its power indicator flickering faintly, not enough to trigger a fault report, not enough to justify intervention, and yet he crouched beside it anyway, setting his toolkit down with quiet care as he opened the casing and examined the internal connections, his fingers moving with practiced precision as he traced the source of the instability. Above him, the surveillance feed adjusted again, focusing more tightly, capturing not just his actions, but the context around them, the fact that this unit had already been marked for deactivation within the next cycle, its continued operation deemed unnecessary, and yet Ethan worked on it as if it mattered, as if its function had value beyond its assigned role. Unit scheduled for removal, the system noted within the observation chamber, its tone unchanged, offering information rather than guidance, and Lyra Vera stood before the projection, her posture still, her gaze steady, absorbing the data while watching something far more significant unfold in the quiet movements of a man who did not know he was being observed. Ethan adjusted a loose connector, reinforcing it with the same care he had shown in every other repair, and when the unit's power stabilized, the flicker fading into a steady glow, he did not stop there. He ran a full diagnostic manually, correcting minor inefficiencies that would have gone unnoticed until the unit was removed, improving something that the system had already decided was no longer worth maintaining. Why maintain a unit that will be discarded? Lyra asked, her voice softer now, not directed at the system as a command, but as a question she could no longer ignore, and the response came. As it always did, precise and unyielding. Resource allocation prioritizes efficiency, non-essential units are removed to optimize output, and for the first time, that answer felt incomplete in a way that could not be corrected by additional data. On the screen, Ethan closed the panel and rested his hand briefly against the unit, a small, unconscious gesture that carried no function, no measurable outcome. And yet it lingered, a moment of acknowledgement that existed entirely outside the system's understanding, and then he stood, gathering his tools as if nothing unusual had occurred, as if he had simply done what needed to be done. Lyra watched him for a long moment, the projection casting soft light across her features as the silence deepened around her, and in that silence, the conflict within her became clear, not between right and wrong, but between two ways of seeing the world, one defined by calculation, the other by something quieter, something that placed value on existence itself rather than its output, and for the first time, she understood that the system she ruled was not incomplete, but limited, and that the presence of one human, unnoticed, unimportant by every measurable standard, had revealed a dimension her empire had never been designed to perceive. She turned away from the projection slowly, not because she had reached a conclusion, but because the question had grown larger than the data could contain, and as she stepped back into the command space where decisions shaped entire systems, she carried with her something new, not uncertainty, but awareness, and with it, the understanding that the next choice she made would not be guided by the system alone. The decision did not arrive with ceremony, and there was no announcement that echoed across the empire to mark the moment something fundamental had changed, because when Empress Lyra Vera finally acted, she did so with the same quiet precision that had defined her rule, yet this time the origin of that precision was no longer the system alone. In the central command chamber, the projection hovered once more, displaying the scheduled decommission sequence for dozens of non-essential units, including the one Ethan Cole had repaired, its status unchanged in the system despite its improved function, because the system did not revise value based on care, only on predefined necessity, and the confirmation prompt waited as it always did, neutral, expectant, ready to execute without question. Proceed with decommission, an advisor stated, their voice steady, confident in the outcome, and for a moment, everything aligned exactly as it should have. The data was correct, the protocol clear, the system ready, but Lyra did not respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the projection as something deeper moved beneath the surface of her thoughts, not doubt, not hesitation, but recognition. She saw not just the units listed for removal, but the unseen effort that had gone into sustaining them, the quiet choices made without instruction, the small acts that had no place in a system designed for efficiency. And for the first time, she understood that removing them was not just a calculation, it was a statement about what mattered, Cancel the sequence, she said, her voice calm, unwavering, and the chamber fell into a silence that carried no confusion, only adjustment, because the command had come from the highest authority, and that authority did not require explanation, yet the system still responded as it was designed to do. Clarification required, resource allocation will be impacted. And for a brief moment, Lyra closed her eyes, not in uncertainty, but in clarity, because the answer had already formed. Reclassify units as maintained assets, she continued, her tone unchanged, yet the meaning behind it shifted everything, and the system processed the command. Recalculating, adapting, integrating a directive that did not originate from its own logic but would now become part of it. Far below, Ethan Cole moved through the same corridor he had passed countless times before, his steps steady, his attention focused on the next small imperfection waiting to be corrected, and he paused as he noticed something unusual. The maintenance panel he had repaired earlier displayed a new status indicator, not a fault, not a warning, but a subtle update marking it as active priority, a designation it had never held before, and he tilted his head slightly, reading the display twice as if to confirm it was real, because systems did not change like that without cause. He did not know the cause, and he did not need to, because for him, the result was enough. The system had recognized something worth maintaining, and that was all that mattered. Above him, in the quiet expanse of the command chamber, Lyra Vera stood alone once more, the projections shifting around her as the Empire adjusted to a new directive, one that would ripple outward in ways no calculation could fully predict, and for the first time since she had taken the throne, she did not feel the need to measure the outcome immediately, because she had already seen its origin. She stepped away from the projection and toward the observation interface, bringing up a single feed, not of fleets or territories or resource flows, but of a man walking alone through a corridor, carrying a toolkit, fixing things no one asked him to fix, and she watched him for a long moment, not as a ruler observing a subject, but as something quieter, something more human. Ethan paused again briefly, not because anything was broken, but because the corridor ahead was clear and still, and for a second, he simply stood there, breathing, existing, and then he moved on. Unaware that his quiet persistence had reshaped the logic of an empire, Lyra did not speak, did not issue another command, because none was needed. The change had already begun, and in the silence that followed, she understood something no system could calculate, that power was not only the ability to control, but the choice to care, and that in a galaxy ruled by efficiency, the smallest act of humanity could become the most enduring form of strength.